Hi, can I be heard?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, that's way too high. There. Okay, great. Starting my speech in three, two, one. Three things in this speech. First of all, why closing opposition is out. Second of all, why opening opposition is out. And then third of all, why our extension's sheer brilliance takes out opening government. Before that, so why is closing opposition out? The first is they have this response to us that is also their argument, saying that the Fed structurally tightens at the wrong time, never has the interest rate at the appropriate time, and it will structurally keep interest rates for too low for too long. I think the first thing we illustrate is that even if you believe this outcome to be the case, as we illustrate, the margin of harm towards people in America is substantially worse than the margin of harm faced by people in other countries due to the nature of the American market and the nature of the American economy that Greg's given three reasons for, to illustrate that they're substantially more resilient and that the harm is much less, given that people are still susceptible to debt crises in other places and that you having counterfactual would exacerbate that debt crisis. But the fact that these countries are substantially weaker to that means that the shockwaves of such a crisis would not only damage more people, but also damage substantially people in substantially worse ways by causing the economy to be far more exposed to systemic risk. Secondly, it's also not clear that the point on temporal, like on doing it too late, is true, since even if it is the case that we do it earlier, which is our case, right? They're saying we do it too late. The problem is that when there are low rate interest rates in recovery, this makes much more of a difference to spending in the developing world because their investments are much more risky, and so they're much more sensitive to how bonds pay, which means that investment is usually higher there and cycles are earlier, which means that we're actually more likely to do it on time, which is why precisely our case proves that the temporal cycles, I guess, align as opposed to them being structurally out of sync in the status quo. We also illustrate again. If their point is that Americans are averse to open deals abroad and that this is for one reason or another out impacts the monetary the money flow from opening opposition, then what we illustrate is that the increase in systemic risk faced by countries abroad due to either the lack of the Fed's ability to cater to the interests of other countries, but more importantly, the countries that are most heavily correlated with the U.S. economy that are now most susceptible to this collapse, unless they are capable of being accommodated for by the U.S. Fed, means that they're actually substantially more amenable to deals abroad because of the fact that there is an explicit mandate as well as a credible signaling mechanism to illustrate that these countries will be cared for by the United States. So presuming that it is primarily about whether or not we're best able to open these deals abroad, it is our side that improves confidence in these countries to ensure job creation for the majority of these people. So that's closing opposition out as we illustrate, because our arguments and the impacts we actually lead to not only do their points better, but we illustrate why their mechanisms mixed with our mechanisms lead to the outcomes we want and not the ones they want. That's closing opposition out. Secondly, what about opening opposition? I think the first thing we do is somewhat similar. The first reason why we take it over them is somewhat similar to what closing opposition, which is they do a great deal of describing the mechanism, but they don't do a great deal of describing why the harm is sufficient to meet the threshold such that the global harm is more important. The global harm of the United States economy performing marginally worse is worse for the global economy than the global economy actually just performing worse and being more exposed to systemic risk. Their only point in this is just to say countries have different needs and they can just kind of assert this. But what we illustrate is that not only are many of the needs generalized in the US bubble, but specifically the needs of the countries that most reliant on the US and thus would mostly be affected are the ones most accounted for in the variable calculation that the Fed would have. So it's those that are specifically least resilient to exogenous shocks, those that are most likely to be hurt by potential debt crises or having a lack of access to savings and so on, are the ones most likely to be affected by the US policy, and as such are most likely to be systemically harmed by a failure to accommodate for things like spending and so on, which means that the margin of change for harm to the global economy is far higher because of the fact that, as we illustrate, the US economy is more resilient, and as such, there's a far higher chance of these shockwaves occurring and potentially happening back to the United States. So there's some time differential. Not only do we ensure that the US economy is more insulated from these shocks because of the fact that in the long run, right, the global recession may still harm the US in the future. So it's the obverse face of their argument. But as we illustrate, because of the fact that the harm is much more keenly felt by other countries first before the US, we reduce the harm of the multiplier effect of that instability and that risk by ensuring that other countries, which would often be the first step to a global shockwave, no longer experience the systemic risk that would be needed in order for a global crisis to occur. That's the first reason why we take out opening opposition, because the margin of change from the optimal policy is far worse for opening opposition than it is for us. Secondly, they have an entire point on political will for giving out money and foreign aid to other countries. The first thing is, as I agree with closing opposition, this somewhat out impacted by our material. But secondly, is that it's not clear to me what the marginal change is, right? If the United States is averse to giving billions of dollars to countries in like Central America or Europe or the Middle East, right? Then it's not clear to me why this change in policy is such a marginal increase in people's like hatred for foreign countries that they would stop doing it. What seems to me the more likely characterization is that the United States benefits from currying favor with other countries and would continue to do so for the very basic reason is that it has investments in these countries it would like to keep maintaining. There's already a fair amount of sunken costs in these countries that it would like to keep, not likely to lose and so on. And there's just general aversion to pulling out of these countries, like because of the sheer backlash that was faced by like the pullout from Afghanistan and so on. It seems to me that there are a variety of reasons for why the political will for giving out money and foreign aid would not substantially decrease in a way that is meaningful or outweighed by the risks to global shock, which I'll then bring up now in the third point in this speech. But I just want to illustrate it's not clear to me that the change is all that large, and even if it is somewhat large, as we will illustrate later, the risk of the exposure to systemic risk for the global economy is far worse when it comes to the world's utility and experience of quality of life. Before that, I'll take a PY from OO.
As Greg concedes, when incentives align, there is no debate. So it's only about when there's a trade-off of the U.S. economy being severely harmed. In this case, the weighing of U.S. contraction matters more because it's very direct, as opposed to somewhat tighter policy, which might influence recovery, but amongst 1,000 other factors.
Yes, what I'm pointing out is that the severe harm to the U.S. economy, severe, right? Like you haven't actually done the description for the severe, is less to the global economy than if the global economy were just directly impacted by this, which is also just, as we've illustrated, right, the systemic exposure to that risk is far worse felt by these other countries, whereas the US has a slew of other tools to insulate itself, not mentioning the fact that the US has control over its domestic economy while other countries have zero control over the domestic economy in the US. Lastly, why does our arguments impact outweigh pretty much everyone else in the round? So I think the first is, it allows us to overtake opening government for the very basic reason that we illustrate not only many of the prerequisite incentives as well as the mechanisms to ensure that the US does investment in the way that they want, because it's somewhat unclear whether or not they would do it in that good way. So we, again, as Greg says, get a fair portion of the benefit that opening government illustrates. But secondly, we also have by and large the greatest impact in the debate: the aversion to crisis and reducing the valence of crisis, the allowance for illustrating that the marginal harm faced by other countries is far worse, but additionally ensuring and imposing a stronger accountability regime on foreign currency, which would be substantially worse if you had China in the reins, which would ensure that many countries would experience a substantial decrease in sovereignty, would experience substantially more risk, especially as China's administration basically plays hooky with the currency and with the rates of that currency would have. At the end of the speech, it's quite clear. Closing government takes this debate, first of all, on a metric of sheer harm that would be experienced by increased exposure to systemic risk for the global economy. And secondly, we also illustrate that we're far more comparative than every other team in the round. And for this reason, you must affirm.
We thank the government whip very much for the fine speech, and we're happy to call upon the opposition whip. Here.
Can everyone